Imagine a world built entirely to satisfy one man's desires, not just his physical wants, but his fantasies, fears, and need for godlike control. That world existed in 18th century France under Louis XV, and it was called Parc aux Cerfs, the Deer Park. On the surface, Louis XV was the perfect image of royalty, well-dressed, well-spoken, and highly educated. He was known as Louis the Beloved in his early years. But what he built behind palace walls was far from love. It was a private system of sexual trafficking, funded by the crown and protected by silence. The Deer Park was a hidden house near Versailles. It wasn't just a brothel, it was a psychological theater where Louis could play out whatever he wanted, without shame or resistance. Teenage girls, often from poor families, were handpicked by agents and brought to the estate. Most didn't know they were being summoned for sex until it was too late. They were trained in manners, dressed in costumes, and expected to perform. Without question, this wasn't about variety. It was about domination without emotion. Louis had mistresses at court, intelligent women who shared conversations, art, and politics with him. But in the Deer Park, he didn't want equals. He wanted obedience, silence, and control. Why? Because Louis, like many powerful men, had become numb. Decades of indulgence had dulled his senses, but once excited him no longer had effect. Psychologists, today, call this desensitization when the brain's pleasure centers become overstimulated, and ordinary intimacy feels empty. The result? A drive for more extreme taboo and often unethical stimulation. In modern terms, Louis was a sexual addict, not in the casual sense, but clinically. He couldn't stop chasing novelty, but the more he consumed, the more meaningless it became. The women in the Deer Park weren't lovers, they were symptoms of a brain broken by excess. But Louis XV was not unique. Centuries earlier, the Chinese Ming Dynasty emperors had their own version of the Deer Park, massive harems filled with thousands of concubines. The Emperor Zhengdi in particular turned his harem into a stage for elaborate fantasies. He would dress as a merchant or a pirate and force women to buy him as if they were peasants. Entire cities were built inside the Forbidden City to fulfill his roles. This isn't simple boredom. It's what psychologists call escapist narcissism, when reality becomes so suffocating that the mind creates its own world and forces others to live inside it. For Zhengid, being emperor wasn't enough. He needed to play other roles, to escape himself, and to turn women into actors in his private theater. And again, it was always safe because no one could say no. This lack of resistance is critical. The human brain is built to function within limits. Social feedback, emotional boundaries, and consequences help us regulate our behavior. But for kings and emperors, those breaks are removed. When a man lives in a world where no one can say stop, his fantasies grow unchecked. They become more extreme, more dangerous, until they override morality completely. Look at Peter, the Great of Russia. Though known for modernizing his country, Peter was also infamous for public orgies, violent sexual games, and forcing his courtiers to participate in humiliating acts. He would stage mock weddings between animals and nobles, strip people naked at court, and sometimes even punish them with torture for entertainment. Historians often brush this off as eccentricity, but from a psychological lens, it's performative sadism, the desire not only to dominate, but to make others suffer in front of an audience. Peter didn't just want pleasure, he wanted witnessed humiliation, a way to prove he controlled not just bodies, but reputations, dignity, and identity. And this, too, is a pattern that repeats. Sultans of the Ottoman Empire, caliphs of Baghdad, even some popes during the Renaissance, all created private sexual kingdoms where they could rewrite the rules of reality. In these places, no one could age, get sick, or say no. Once a woman aged or resisted, she was removed, replaced, or worse, silenced forever. These sexual kingdoms were never about connection. They were about erasing limits, a world where desire had no boundary, and therefore, no meaning. But here's the deeper truth that history reveals. These men weren't just perverse, they were terrified. Terrified of boredom. Terrified of mortality. Terrified of being seen as weak, and so they turned to sex, not to express intimacy, but to escape fear. It became a tool to prove, I'm still powerful, I'm still in control. I can still feel something. Modern psychology now recognizes several key patterns in these rulers. Compulsive escapism, the need to flee from emotional discomfort by building fantasy worlds. Narcissistic personality disorder, a deep-seated belief in one's divine importance, combined with emotional detachment. Sexual addiction, not driven by desire, but by anxiety and numbness. Sadistic control, pleasure in seeing others powerless, because it masks the ruler's own inner weakness. Even today, this doesn't feel like ancient history. The same patterns appear in modern scandals, celebrities with secret abuse rings, cult leaders who exploit followers, billionaires caught in trafficking operations. The robes and palaces are gone, but the psychology remains. We now understand that unaccountable power warps the brain. It creates emotional shortcuts where empathy dies and ego becomes law. Without feedback, without challenge, the powerful man begins to believe that his fantasy is reality, and anyone who resists becomes a threat to be removed. This is why so many powerful men destroy the very people closest to them. History remembers kings and emperors as builders of nations, creators of armies, and guardians of empires. But behind the golden thrones, velvet robes, and royal decrees lies a truth far darker. When a man has absolute power, his desires mutate. His mind bends, not just toward tyranny or cruelty, but toward deep, obsessive, and often violent sexual control. Let us begin in ancient Rome, a place where emperors weren't merely rulers but living gods. Among them, none exemplified the rot of unlimited power more than Caligula. When Caligula became emperor at the age of 24, the people of Rome hoped he would restore sanity after the reign of the paranoid Tiberius. But instead, Caligula's rule devolved into a horrifying display of excess, humiliation, and sexual cruelty. He turned his palace into a brothel, forcing the wives and daughters of Roman senators to serve guests. He would summon noblemen's wives, sleep with them in front of their husbands, and return to the feast to mock the men for their wives' performance. But perhaps the darkest element was Caligula's obsession with his own family. Roman historians record that he committed incest with all three of his sisters, particularly Drusilla, who he treated as his consort. After she died, Caligula went into public mourning, calling her the wife of Caesar. Some accounts suggest she may have even been pregnant by him and that he forced her to abort the child. Modern psychology recognizes this behavior as narcissistic sadism, the merging of self-worship and domination. For Caligula, sex was never about pleasure alone. It was about degrading others, asserting his godlike status, and turning the nobility into submissive participants in his madness. He didn't just want control over Rome's laws. He wanted control over their bodies, dignity, and minds. Then came Nero, perhaps even more twisted in psychological complexity. Nero's reign was marked by erratic behavior, sexual deviance, and murderous rage. Among his most infamous acts was his marriage to Sporus, a young boy whom Nero castrated, dressed in women's clothing, and paraded as his wife. He even referred to him as Papoya, after his previous wife whom he had beaten to death while she was pregnant. This is more than bizarre behavior, it's trauma-driven repetition. Psychologists call this repetition compulsion, the attempt to recreate traumatic events in a controllable way. Nero had lost his mother, was manipulated by court politics, and murdered those closest to him. His marriage to Sporus wasn't just deviant, it was a twisted attempt to undo the guilt of killing Papoya by recreating her in a powerless, obedient form. We might think this behavior is isolated to ancient Rome, a time of decadence and madness. But fast forward 1,000 years, and the same sickness appears in a more refined, more Christian monarch, Henry VIII of England. Henry wasn't outwardly sexually deviant, but his desires were shaped by fear, obsession, and a profound sense of divine entitlement. Obsessed with producing a male heir, Henry went through 6 wives, discarding them like broken toys. 2 Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard were executed for alleged adultery. In Anne's case, the charges were almost certainly fabricated. Why such extreme reactions? Because Henry's sense of masculinity, godliness, and royal identity were tied to his ability to reproduce a male heir. Failure wasn't just disappointing, it was emasculating. Rather than confront his own fertility issues or consider medical explanations, Henry projected all blame onto his wives. If a queen couldn't give him a son, it was because she was impure, unfaithful, or cursed. This is a classic example of what psychologists call narcissistic injury. When a person's fragile self-image is shattered by failure, they lash out. With fury, Henry wasn't trying to understand his wives, he was punishing them for making him feel weak. And since he was king, his insecurity became